America's most secretive military unit is not, at its core, an American invention. The most feared special operations force the United States has ever built, Delta Force, is in almost every way that matters a copy of a British one. Its selection, its structure, its culture, even the specific test that breaks most of the men who try out, were all lifted from another country's army by one obsessed American colonel who decided that the British had already solved the problem and that the smartest thing he could do was steal their answer whole. This is the story of how Delta Force copied the British Special Air Service, the SAS, right down to its cruelest test, and why its founder refused to change a single thing. That colonel was Charlie Beckwith, and his obsession began with a year abroad. In the early 1960s, Beckwith was sent on an exchange tour with the British SAS, embedded with the very regiment that had invented modern special operations during the Second World War. He went as a confident American officer. He came back a changed man, because what he saw in Britain rearranged everything he thought he knew about how elite soldiers should be built. This was not a classroom tour. Beckwith served alongside the SAS in the field, sharing the hardship and the risk with them, and that is why it marked him so deeply. He did not read about the regiment in a manual. He lived inside it, watched it work under real pressure, and came to trust its methods, the way a man can only trust something he has seen prove itself with his own eyes. What he saw was the opposite of the American way. The United States Army of that era thought in terms of mass, big units, big firepower, overwhelming numbers. The SAS thought in terms of the individual. It was small, it was ruthlessly selective. It did not want the biggest, strongest, most aggressive soldiers. It wanted intelligent, mature, independent men who could operate in tiny teams, deep behind enemy lines, thinking for themselves with no one to give them orders. It valued the quiet professional over the loud warrior. And it had a selection process designed not to test how much a man could bench press, but whether his mind would hold together when his body was destroyed. Beckwith came home on fire with the idea that America needed its own version of this, and he ran straight into a wall. The big army did not want to hear it. The whole philosophy of the SAS, small teams of independent thinkers, cut against the grain of how the American military saw itself. For years he briefed the concept, pushed it, argued for it, and for years he was told no. It took more than a decade, and the rising threat of international terrorism in the 1970s, before the Army finally, reluctantly, gave him permission to build the thing he had first imagined on those British moors. Delta Force was born in 1977, and from its first day it was modeled directly on the SAS. The first thing Beckwith copied was the most important, and it is the reason so many elite soldiers fail to make it into Delta. It is the selection. He took the SAS philosophy, find the mind and not the muscle, and he built an American version of the exact test the British used to do it. And to understand that test, you have to understand the British original that inspired it, because it is one of the most brutal things any military asks of a volunteer. The SAS calls the climax of its selection endurance. It takes place in the Brecon Beacons, a range of cold, wet, unforgiving mountains in Wales. On the final test, a candidate must cross roughly 40 miles of that brutal terrain, carrying a pack that weighs upward of 55 pounds, and he must do it in under 20 hours, alone, navigating by map and compass with no help and no encouragement. Men have died attempting it. It is not a test of fitness alone. It is a test of whether a man will keep driving himself forward, hour after hour, in misery, when every part of him is screaming to stop, and there is no one there to make him continue. Beckwith looked at that test, and he did not soften it for American consumption. He recreated it. Delta's selection culminates in what the unit calls the long walk, and it is the British endurance test transplanted onto American mountains, roughly 40 miles. A rucksack that climbs past its brutal starting weight as the event grinds on. A punishing, unpublished time standard the candidate is never told. Alone, in the wilderness, with a map and a compass and his own collapsing will. Beckwith took the single hardest thing the British did to find their best men, and he made it the single hardest thing America would do to find hers. If you are enjoying the real lineage of these units, the parts that never make the movies, subscribe to War Code, because the selection was only the beginning of what Beckwith copied, and the rest of it reshaped American special operations forever. To understand why this British system was worth copying so faithfully, you have to know where the SAS itself came from. It was born in the deserts of North Africa during the Second World War, the idea of a young officer named David Stirling, who argued that a tiny number of highly trained men, striking by surprise deep behind enemy lines, could do damage out of all proportion to their numbers. Nearly everyone told him it was madness, that small teams would simply be swallowed up. Instead, his handful of raiders slipped onto enemy airfields in the dark and destroyed aircraft on the ground by the hundreds, more than conventional forces managed in some stretches of the campaign. The lesson burned itself into the regiment's identity. It is not the size of the force that matters. It is the quality of the men and the audacity of the plan. That was the philosophy Beckwith fell in love with. Not a set of tactics, but an entire theory of war built around the individual, and it was already battle-proven by the time he arrived to learn it. Because he did not stop at the test. He copied the culture, and the culture was as un-American, by the standards of the time, as the selection. In the SAS, rank is played down. Officers and enlisted men operate on a first-name basis in a way that would horrify a conventional army. The focus is on the quality of a man's thinking, not the number of stripes on his sleeve. Beckwith brought that directly into Delta, building a unit where a young operator's judgment could outweigh an officer's rank, where the culture prized competence over ceremony, and where the loud, chest-beating soldier was quietly seen as a liability rather than an asset. He copied the way they planned, too. The SAS had a tradition of open planning sessions where, once the discussion began, any man in the room could speak, could question the plan, could challenge a senior officer's idea if he thought it was flawed. The most junior operator could look at the most senior and say, "That will not work, and here is why." The regiment even had a name for it, an informal and almost irreverent tradition sometimes called a Chinese parliament, where once the planning started, rank went quiet, and the best idea was meant to win, no matter whose mouth it came out of. For a rigid, hierarchical army, that was almost heresy, but Beckwith understood why it worked. The men who were going to execute the mission, and die if it was wrong, were often the ones who could see the flaw first. So he built that same openness into Delta, a culture where the plan mattered more than the pride of the man who proposed it. And he copied the shape of the unit itself. The SAS was organized into small squadrons, broken down into troops, broken down again into tiny patrols of just a handful of men, each expected to operate alone and self-sufficient for long periods. Delta took that same structure. Not big companies and battalions, but small, tight elements built for independence and initiative. The whole architecture of the unit, from the individual operator all the way up, was British in its bones. It is worth pausing on how unusual it is to copy something this well. Plenty of armies around the world looked at the SAS and tried to build their own version. Most of them failed, and they failed in the same way. They copied the surface. They copied the badge, the beret, the swagger, the name, the idea of an elite unit, without copying the thing that actually mattered, which was the merciless selection and the culture of the thinking soldier. It is easy to hand out a special badge. It is hard to build a process that turns away almost everyone who wants one. Beckwith understood that the magic was not in the symbols, it was in the filter and in the mindset. So while others copied the costume, he copied the machine underneath it, and that is why his version became the real thing when so many others were elite in name only. Now here is the question that makes this story more than a list of things one man borrowed. Why did Beckwith copy it so faithfully? Why not take the good ideas and improve them, add an American twist, make it better? The answer tells you everything about the man. He had watched the SAS work up close for a year. He had seen, with his own eyes, that the process produced exactly the kind of soldier he wanted, and he made a decision that took real humility. He decided that he did not fully understand why every piece of the British system worked, only that it did, and that if he started changing pieces to suit his own taste, he might accidentally break the very thing that made it effective. He was afraid that if he Americanized the selection, if he made it a little less lonely, a little less cruel, a little more forgiving, he would end up with men who were slightly too willing to quit when it counted. So he left it alone. He copied the mold, and he protected it. There is a deep irony in all of this. The unit that Americans think of as the ultimate expression of homegrown toughness, the secretive, legendary Delta Force, is in its DNA a British transplant, and the relationship never ended. Delta and the SAS have trained together for decades, two versions of the same original idea, close enough to be family and competitive enough to needle each other endlessly, the American copy forever measuring itself against the British source that gave it life. That faith in the mold was tested almost immediately, and cruelly. Delta's first major mission, only 3 years after the unit was born, was an attempt to rescue American hostages held in Iran. It ended in disaster in the desert, But the failure did not come from the men or their training. It came from mechanical breakdowns and the chaos of too many separate forces trying to work together for the first time. Beckwith's operators were ready. The machine around them was not. And in a painful way, that outcome vindicated the very philosophy he had copied, because the part of the mission that depended on the quality of the individual man held up, while the parts that depended on everything else fell apart. The lesson America finally took from that desert was not that Beckwith had built the wrong unit. It was that the nation had to build the rest of the system up to the standard of the men Delta was already producing. There was one more thing the SAS gave Delta that you cannot put on an organization chart, and that is an attitude. The regiment's motto is only 3 words long: "Who dares wins." It is a statement of belief that the bold, calculated risk taken by the right men beats caution and mass. Beckwith did not just copy the selection and the structure. He imported that entire spirit, the conviction that a small number of exceptional men, daring greatly, could accomplish what whole armies could not. So the next time you hear Delta Force described as America's answer to the world's threats, remember where the answer actually came from. It came from a young officer who spent a year with a foreign army, saw something that worked, and had the rare wisdom to copy it exactly, instead of pretending he could do better. Beckwith's genius was not invention. It was recognition, and the humility to steal a great idea whole, rather than ruin it trying to make it his own. That is why Delta Force trains like the SAS, thinks like the SAS, and breaks its candidates on a mountain the exact same way the SAS does. It was built to, and there is no shame in it. The best armies in the world have always studied one another, and the mark of a great officer is not that he invents everything from nothing. It is that he can tell the difference between a good idea and a bad one, and that he has the humility to adopt the good one even when it was born under another nation's flag. If you want more of the hidden history behind the world's most secretive units, subscribe to War Code, and I will see you on the next one.